I'm Sam McKagan, and I'm going to be giving the Devar Torah today. So I'm going to be giving an unabashedly political Devar today because I believe that in our current political crisis, it's no longer possible to be apolitical, and that religion, which is all about standing up for what is good, moral, and decent, now requires taking a political stand. And honestly, I suspect it's probably always been that way, but it's only just now coming into focus for me. So I really didn't want to give the talk tonight. I've already given 2 Devars in the last few months, both about fairly intense subjects that struck a deep chord in my soul. I gave one about conversion and one about the recent election. So I felt like I'd kind of done my duty. So, when I saw the call go out for volunteers for tonight, I decided I would, stand back and let somebody else have a turn. And, I've been really busy with political activism this week, and I really didn't have time to write a talk. But the theme of this week's Torah portion, which is about the plagues, the last of the plagues, kept getting under my skin. I mean, it's hard not to see, at least for me, it's hard not to see parallels between today's world and the plagues. I don't know about you, but I've been seeing an awful lot of plagues in the world these days, so I felt like this Devar Torah would kind of write itself. So I hope it did. You can be the judge of that. So I kept waiting for somebody else to step up. And, meanwhile, I was reading the Torah portion, and it kept kind of percolating in my head, and nobody else stepped up, so here I am. So generally, I believe that the words of the Torah contain a great deal of wisdom that's still relevant to the current day, but I don't usually expect that the way the Torah portions were assigned by ancient rabbis to be distributed across the year usually literally correlates with current events. But I don't know. I have to say that the way the Torah portions have been falling over the last few weeks has been a little bit eerie. And during this challenging time, I've been drawing inspiration from specific passages in a way that I've never had before, feeling like what's happening in the Torah this week is just so directly relevant to what's happening in our world right now. So as we saw a couple weeks ago on the Shabbat that started on the evening of the presidential inauguration, the Torah portion for the week began, "A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph." And well, today it kind of seems like we have a new king that doesn't really know us. So then last week the plagues began, and then in this week's Torah portion we see the last 4 plagues and the Israelites finally fleeing from Egypt. So there's a lot of interpretations about the plagues and what they mean, but there's one interpretation that Rabbi Olivier often talks about, in which the plagues were not really for the Egyptians, but they were for us. So the plagues were demonstrations for us to see God's power and to wake up out of our complacency. So at this point in the story, the Israelites had been enslaved for 400 years. Why had they never risen up before? They needed the plagues to wake them up. So today, we have our own plagues that are waking us up. Every day, there seems to be a new series of plagues that comes along to wake us up, and we are waking up. So there's one incredible silver lining that I've seen to the horror that's overtaken our country, and that silver lining is the resistance. There are people who've never been politically active who are suddenly speaking out, protesting, and organizing. The Women's March, the day after the inauguration, was the largest protest in U.S. history, with 1% of all Americans participating. Voice mailboxes for senators and congresspeople are regularly full from so many people calling. Many politicians are speaking out and refusing to cooperate. Civil servants are refusing to obey unconstitutional orders. Organizations, large and small, are writing letters of protest. Protesters and lawyers are showing up at airports at a moment's notice to fight on behalf of immigrants, and lawyers are filing lawsuits against the craziness and winning. The resistance gives me great hope for the future. As long as we continue to speak out and fight back, there's a chance that our country will not descend into fascism. and we will not be doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past. So the fighting back is something that gives me a lot of hope. So at the same time, there are many people from oppressed groups and those who've been fighting alongside them for years who are asking of the rest of us, well, where have you been? We've been in slavery for 400 years, and you are late showing up to the party. And they are right, and we should listen. At the same time, I want to celebrate and not just castigate the people who are waking up. But I think it's important to remember that it took the plagues to wake us up. Things are really bad now, but even before the current administration, we were rapidly destroying the planet. The gap between the rich and the poor was widening. Corporations were gaining more power while humans gained less. We were engaging in an awful lot of wars. Innocent black people were being killed by police practically every day. Gun violence was becoming epidemic. And we were not letting in nearly enough of the desperate refugees who begged to come to our country. And I'll be the first to admit that if Hillary Clinton had been elected president, I probably would have sunk into complacency and not done nearly enough about these things. But because of the plague of our current president, I've woken up, I'm acting, and I don't think I'll ever be the same. Not even if we have free and fair elections in 4 years and a really great person who I totally agree with gets elected president. I don't think there's any going back at this point. At least I hope not. So I don't believe, as some religious people do, that God purposely creates plagues to teach us lessons. I personally can't believe in a God that cruel, but I do believe that we learn from plagues, and sometimes plagues are the only thing that can wake us up. So while I'm not grateful for the plagues themselves, I thank God every day for the awakening and the resistance that they've brought. So that's one interpretation of the plagues, that they are plagues in our own lives that God brought to show us and wake us up. But a friend reminded me this week that there's also a much more traditional interpretation, the literal, normal one, which is that the plagues were not actually for us, they were for the Egyptians. I guess that was in there somewhere. So, what it says in the Torah is that while the Egyptians suffered, we were spared from the plagues. And each of the plagues was specifically crafted to get under the Egyptian skin and show the superiority of our God over the Egyptian gods. So scholars who have studied the history of this point out that turning the Nile to blood was an affront to the Egyptian river god. Darkness was an affront to the Egyptian sun god. And other plagues poked fun at the Egyptian frog, cow, and bull gods. And the slaying of the firstborn fulfilled an ancient Egyptian prophecy about judgment coming on a day when all the firstborn were killed. So these plagues were written very precisely. I mean, today they all just sound kind of crazy, like, why did that weird thing happen? But they were written very precisely to get at the Egyptians and the things that the Egyptians held most dear, and to turn those things up on their heads and bother the Egyptians. These plagues were acts of civil disobedience. They were designed to get under the skin of a thin-skinned and cruel leader in order to push him to change his policies. I don't know anything about that, but so Moses enacted each of these plagues with God working through him. And today, God is acting through us to send a new set of plagues to our Pharaoh. The Women's March, the phone calls, the rogue park service, the mayors declaring sanctuary cities, the lawsuits from the ACLU, the protesters showing up at the airport, and those videos from the Netherlands and Switzerland. I don't know if you've seen those, but Google them, where they say America first, but Netherlands second. Brilliant. Anyway, our movement has a lot of plagues for the new administration. So in the story, with each plague, Pharaoh thinks about giving in to Moses' demand and then changes his mind. We usually read that after each plague, God hardened Pharaoh's heart, which seems a little cruel, that God is kind of messing with Pharaoh and hardening his heart. And I didn't really know how to make sense of this this phrase. So I went to the translation of the Torah by Everett Fox, which Olivier says is the most true to the original Hebrew, to see what it said in that translation. And instead it says, God made Pharaoh's heart strong-willed, which I interpret to mean that Pharaoh was made by God with a strong-willed heart, and this heart made it hard to change his mind. All around us, we face strong-willed leaders who are not willing to listen or change their minds. But this Torah portion gives us a lesson that we must never give up. No matter how hard-hearted Pharaoh is, Moses wanted to quit after every plague, to give up, to say this will never work. We've been here for 400 years, why don't we just stay? I don't want to keep pushing. But with God's help, he persevered. This too has been playing out in my life lately. So, because I needed to find a place with a small scale problem where I might be able to make a larger difference than at the national level, over the last couple weeks I've decided to take on education funding in Washington State. I mean, that's a problem I can solve in a couple weeks, right? No, actually, it turns out it's not. So I went to a budget meeting, a state budget meeting a couple weeks ago, and sort of saw the depth of the problem and what was needed. And I also saw that lots of parents and people who cared deeply about this issue were not hearing about it. That there were people that wanted to make a difference and they weren't hearing about it. And I was like, okay, I can do that. I can get the word out. So last week, after researching the situation, mobilizing my communities, and making a lot of phone calls, on Monday I drove to Olympia to testify before the Washington State Senate Ways and Means Committee and asked them to please move forward with a bill that is desperately and urgently needed, because if it is not passed immediately, schools across the state won't be able to hire enough teachers and staff for next year. This seems like kind of a no-brainer that this should pass, but there are some senators who happen to be in charge of the Senate right now who don't want to vote for it. The order of the bills being heard was switched at the last minute, and dozens of parents who had driven long distance to testify had to wait hours as they argued about this other bill, which was a terrible education bill, which had been introduced 2 days before on a Saturday and was now being shoved through really quickly without enough time for anyone to process. So we all got to listen to that hearing and then wait for hours and hours, and then testify. And so we waited, and after 3 hours, a lot of parents, school teachers, principals, superintendents, and other concerned citizens spoke out about the desperate need for this bill and how it would impact our schools if it didn't pass soon. The other bill was quickly, and so the senators listened to all of these parents talking about their personal stories and how this would impact their bills, at least the senators that were still there. A disturbing number of them left, but anyway. So then after that, they didn't vote on the bill, like they just left it sitting there. And the other bill got quickly voted out of committee, then passed by the full Senate, and just moved on, while the bill that we desperately need to make a difference is still sitting there, with the Senate having taken no action at all. So I know the senators got a lot of calls, and they listened to parents telling them heartbreaking stories of what would happen to their children's schools without this funding, and they did nothing. It felt like God had hardened their hearts and they just didn't care. So I was getting pretty discouraged after this. I've been feeling really discouraged and just wanting to give up. I tried for 2 weeks and they didn't listen. But this week the Torah has given me the strength to keep fighting, to remind me that you don't just quit when the first plague doesn't work, that you figure out how to make some bigger plagues, and you keep fighting. And so I'm going to keep fighting. And there was recently a protest sign that said I was trained for this in Hebrew school. I think these are the times when religion matters most. These are the times when religion gives us the inner strength to keep fighting, keep standing up for what's right, even when nothing in the world supports us and there's no hope that our actions will make a difference. What we're trained for in this and other religious communities is to listen to God and to follow what's right and what we know is right, even when it doesn't match what's happening in the external world. So this is the time when we need our Torah to be our inner light and our tree of life.